The crack of the gavel split the air like a thunderclap. Marble walls carried the sound outward, bouncing it through the chamber until it seemed the entire room was vibrating with authority. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her eyes hard, her jaw set, in a voice that tried to disguise fury beneath judicial formality. She uttered a word so rare in this setting, it froze even seasoned reporters in their seats. Sanctions. The threat wasn't directed at a lawyer fumbling an argument or a witness refusing to comply. No, Judge Howell had aimed her gavel at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The room erupted in whispers. Reporters darted their pens across aides shifted nervously in their seats, and even hardened political operatives leaned toward one another, stunned. A sitting member of Congress, sanctioned in open court. It was more than unusual. It was nearly unthinkable. Judge Howell's robe swayed as she sat back, satisfied with the shock her words had delivered. In her mind, the point was clear. Authority was not to be challenged, not even by an elected official. Yet at the center of the storm sat Jasmine Crockett, unflinching. She didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't so much as bow her head. Where others saw danger, Crockett saw an opportunity. Her eyes locked on the bench with a steadiness that suggested she had already measured the judge's authority and found it wanting. The gavel strike had been meant to silence her. Instead, it gave her the stage. One could almost feel it in the air, like the pause before a storm, the quiet before lightning rips across the sky. Crockett's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something quieter and more dangerous. Resolve. Murmurs swelled again, this time tinged with anticipation. What would she do? Would she retreat, submit, play the game of deference? Or would she become the one voice in that courtroom, brave enough to challenge the very institution that sought to humiliate her? The judge thought the gavel had settled the matter, but the real matter, the one that would echo far beyond that chamber, was only just beginning. The gavel came down, but the real blow was still to come. To understand the weight of that gavel strike, you have to understand the woman who wielded it. Judge Beryl Howell is no stranger to high-profile cases. She has built her career on a reputation of stern rulings, clipped tones, and a near-theatrical insistence on control. To her admirers, she is the embodiment of order, a judge who brooks no nonsense. But to her critics, Howell's bench is less about justice and more about dominance, an arena where dissent is treated like defiance and authority is defended at all costs. Every time her gavel falls, it carries not only the force of law but the weight of her pride. And then there was Jasmine Crockett, the exact kind of figure Howell was unused to facing. A freshman congresswoman from Texas. Crockett had earned her stripes not by playing it safe, but by playing it loud and fiery, unapologetic, unwilling to soften her words for fragile ears. She built her identity on standing firm in the face of those who thought they could shame her into silence. She wasn't in that courtroom to make friends, and she certainly wasn't there to bow. She was there because her very presence in the halls of power had already unsettled the status quo. So when Howell leveled the word sanctions at her, the gravity wasn't just legal, it was historic. A judge threatening punitive action against a sitting member of Congress. That kind of collision between the judicial and legislative branches simply didn't happen. It was like watching two tectonic plates grind against one another. The ground didn't just shake in that chamber, it reverberated through the foundations of democracy itself. And that is why the whispers that followed weren't just whispers of curiosity, they were whispers of fear. If a judge could target a lawmaker this way, if authority could be used to muzzle not only attorneys but elected representatives, then where did the silencing end? If voices like Crockett's could be stripped of legitimacy with the swing of a gavel, what chance did ordinary citizens have when they dared to speak up? The room knew what was at stake, even if no one spoke it aloud. This wasn't about one dispute or one moment of courtroom decorum. It was about whether power would tolerate dissent at all. And for millions watching beyond those walls, the choice seemed clear. Jasmine Crockett couldn't just back down. To yield here would mean yielding for every voice that had ever been told to sit down and know its place. She knew it too. Her stillness, her piercing gaze, it all spoke to the truth that she wasn't simply defending herself. She was defending the principle of dissent itself, the right to stand in defiance of intimidation, the right to be heard even when power would rather shut you up. The stakes had risen far. Beyond Crockett's reputation or Howell's pride, they had risen into the realm of constitutional drama, where one woman's response could signal to an entire nation whether justice still belonged to the people, or whether it had been captured by those in robes and gavels. But before Crockett could respond, the judge made a move that shocked even seasoned court watchers. Long before the gavel struck against Jasmine Crockett, Judge Beryl Howell had built an empire of reputation around herself. Her career began in the corridors of power, where politics and law blur into one. And from the very start, she carried herself as though she were not just interpreting the law, but shaping it. Colleagues spoke of her sharp intellect, her tireless work ethic, and her sheer presence on the bench. She wasn't the type of judge who blended into the background. She dominated her courtroom like a general on a battlefield, issuing orders, making her will felt, and leaving no doubt about who controlled the room. Over the years, this became her calling card. Rulings delivered with an iron grip, hearings where her word was final, exchanges where her authority was the only compass. Admirers praised her firmness, but critics used another word: overreach. They said Howell had a habit of blurring the line between ensuring order and enforcing obedience. To her, dissent often looked suspiciously like disruption, and the hammer of her gavel fell fastest on those who dared to challenge her. Case after case, the pattern emerged. Lawyers who pushed too hard found themselves cut off mid-sentence. Witnesses who strayed from narrow answers found themselves scolded. And in moments when politics crept too close to the bench, Howell's rulings leaned toward silencing the very voices that unsettled establishment comfort. For those who watched closely, her robe did not symbolize blind justice, it symbolized a weapon cloaked in neutrality, a shield for authority disguised as fairness. Yet Howell's public image told a different story. To the media, she was often framed as impartial, tough but balanced, a judge who carried the dignity of her position with pride. Articles praised her as a model of judicial independence. Profiles painted her as a disciplined guardian of the law. But peel back the veneer, and contradictions appeared. Decisions that disproportionately punished outsiders while insulating the powerful. Language that dismissed critics as unserious. A style that looked less like even-handed justice, and more like personal domination of the courtroom stage. It was this contradiction that made her so polarizing. To one side, she was a heroine of control, an arbiter who stood above the political fray. To the other, she was a villain in plain sight, using her bench not as a platform for fairness but as a throne of arrogance. And in the showdown with Jasmine Crockett, that villainous side shone brightest because Howell's overconfidence had calcified into something more. Dangerous certainty that she could not be challenged. The robe she wore became not just a garment of duty but a symbol of superiority. She had silenced lawyers, chastised defendants, and carved her reputation in rulings that often left the powerless still. And now, she believed she could do the same to a congresswoman. But that belief was not simply arrogance, it was blindness. Blindness to the moment, blindness to the woman seated before her, blindness to the shifting mood of a public increasingly wary of authority figures. Using their power like cudgels, Howell's flaw wasn't just that she overreached. It was that she assumed the robe gave her the final word in every clash, no matter who stood across from her. The truth is, she had faced countless opponents, but rarely one like Jasmine Crockett. Howell had grown accustomed to challengers who bent under her scorn, who stumbled when cut off mid-sentence, who weighed the risks and chose submission over confrontation. But Crockett was not built to yield, and that was the danger. Howell failed to see the danger that would soon turn her gavel strike into a symbol of overreach, and Crockett's response into a rallying cry. In Howell's courtroom, the robe was supposed to be untouchable. The judge was supposed to stand above the fray, immune to challenge, unshaken by resistance. Yet for all her experience, for all her confidence, for all the myths built around her authority, Judge Beryl Howell miscalculated the one truth she could not afford to ignore. To understand why Jasmine Crockett sat in that courtroom unshaken, you have to begin in Texas, where her story first took root. She wasn't born into privilege, nor was her path paved by dynasties or deep-pocketed donors. She was the daughter of a community that knew struggle, where justice often felt like a luxury, and where the rules were not written with everyone in mind. From an early age, Crockett witnessed the kind of inequality most judges and lawmakers only read about in case files. She saw neighbors ignored, families written off, entire communities treated as if their voices were background noise, and she carried those images with her. It wasn't long before she chose the law as her weapon, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. As an attorney, Crockett's reputation grew quickly. She was fearless in the courtroom, unafraid to take on cases others considered unwinnable. Clients came to her not just because she was sharp, but because she cared, because she fought as if the verdict were personal. She knew what it meant to stand in a room where the scales of justice tilted against you, and she was determined to level them. But stepping into politics brought the firebrand out of her even more. In Texas, she entered the arena of sharp elbows and relentless attacks, where political theater was designed to humiliate and intimidate. Opponents mocked her tone, her style, her refusal to water down her convictions. Insults rolled off her like rain on steel. Every barb hurled at her only seemed to sharpen her edge. They called her too loud, too direct, too unapologetic, and yet those were the very qualities that made her indispensable to the people who felt ignored. Crockett learned quickly that in politics, truth alone wasn't enough. You had to defend it with your whole chest. You had to meet arrogance with clarity, insults with facts, and intimidation with unshakable will. And so, she carved out her identity, a voice unwilling to be boxed in by tradition or decorum, unwilling to let the gatekeepers of power dictate how she should speak, dress, or carry herself. She was not there to make the powerful comfortable. She was there to make them accountable. This defiance wasn't reckless. It was rooted in principle, in the belief that representation meant something deeper than holding a title. It meant embodying the frustrations of those who had been silenced. For every person told they were too much, for every worker ignored, for every immigrant dismissed, Crockett's voice carried their weight. She wasn't just one woman in Congress, she was a mirror for millions who longed to be heard. That is why her presence became more than personal. When she spoke, she wasn't just speaking for Jasmine Crockett. She was speaking for the young attorney trying to be taken seriously in a courtroom that doubted her, for the parent who couldn't get justice when the system stacked the deck, for the student whose voice shook but still dared to speak truth to power. She became a vessel of resistance, the embodiment of the idea that the people's voice doesn't have to be polite to be powerful. Her rise wasn't accidental. It was forged through trial by fire, through moments where others would have folded. In state politics, she endured attacks meant to shame her into silence, but each one only refined her resolve. When opponents underestimated her, she used it as fuel. When critics dismissed her, she transformed their mockery into momentum. And by the time she arrived in Washington, she had grown into something more formidable than her detractors ever imagined. A lawmaker who refused to treat intimidation as anything more than background noise. That history, the grit of Texas courtrooms, the sting of personal attacks, the endless battle against entrenched power, had prepared her for exactly this kind of moment. Sitting in Judge Howell's courtroom, Crockett wasn't simply a defendant in the judge's theater of authority. She was a woman who had weathered storms harsher than insults, who had carried burdens heavier than threats, and who had never once allowed herself to be silenced. The gavel strike might have stunned the room, but it didn't stun her. Crockett knew exactly who she was and who she represented, and she knew something else. Silence was not her language. Her voice, sharp and unapologetic, had always been her greatest weapon. It was a voice born in Texas, tested in the crucible of law and politics, and honed against every attempt to diminish her. So when the judge tried to end the matter with a swing of wood against marble, Crockett sat still, letting the moment hang. To some, it looked like compliance. But those who knew her knew better. That pause wasn't surrendered, was the gathering of energy. The calm before the storm. The chamber, already tense, seemed to shrink with every word exchanged. Judge Howell leaned forward, her voice rising above the restless murmurs. She repeated her declaration of sanctions as though repetition alone would make it law. The gavel slammed again, a punctuation mark meant to rattle its target into submission. But Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved, her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on the bench like an unblinking challenge. Congresswoman, Howell said, stretching the title in a way that carried more rebuke than respect. This is my courtroom, and you will respect my authority. Gasps fluttered across the room. Reporters' pens tore at the paper, desperate to capture every word, while aides shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The line between judicial formality and personal vendetta was thinning, and everyone could feel it. Crockett tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her next words with deliberate care. Her tone, when it came, was calm but edged with steel. Respect, Judge Howell, is errandt demanded. The gallery erupted in whispers, some stifled gasps turning into open shock. The air thickened with disbelief. Few had ever dared to push back so directly against this judge, and certainly not in front of a packed courtroom. Howell's nostrils flared. She reached for her gavel again, holding it high, but the motion betrayed her frustration more than her strength. You are out of line, she hissed. This court does not tolerate grandstanding. You will comply, or you will face consequences. But Crockett did not bend. She leaned forward in her seat, her hands clasped before her, her voice steady. What you call grandstanding, I call standing my ground. You may control this courtroom, but you do not control the truth. Every word seemed to vibrate in the air. Reporters scribbled frantically, knowing history was unfurling in real time. Some craned their necks, trying to read the judge's expression. The robe, once an impenetrable shield of authority, now seemed to hang heavier on Howell's shoulders. For the first time, the cracks were showing. Her jaw tightened, her lips pressed thin, and her eyes flickered with something dangerous - uncertainty. The audience leaned forward, captivated. They could sense it. The balance of power was shifting, if only slightly, and Howell knew it. The more she demanded submission, the more Crockett's defiance rang out as courage. Every exchange heightened the drama, pulling the room closer to the edge of a breaking point. Howell slammed the gavel once more, the sound sharper than before, more desperate than decisive. This is not a debate, Congresswoman. You will answer to this court, or you will face sanction, effective immediately. Crockett let the silence stretch. Seconds ticked like thunder in the minds of those watching. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the judge as though measuring not just the words, but the fear behind them. And then she spoke with a composure that made the entire chamber go still. Threaten me if you must, but I will not betray the people who sent me here just to make you comfortable. The words dropped like stones into water, rippling outward. Reporters froze mid-sentence, realizing the moment had crystallized into something unforgettable. Even the gallery seemed to stop breathing. Caught between awe and dread, Judge Howell's hand trembled faintly on the gavel. The first sign that her command of the room was slipping. What was supposed to be a demonstration of her dominance was unraveling into a demonstration of Crockett's resolve. The storm was no longer on the horizon, it was hovering right above the room, ready to break open. Every ear strained for what would come next, every pen hovering above the page. Every eye locked on the woman who had refused to yield. The silence, before it happened, felt like an eternity. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't fumble for notes. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her hands folded on the table, as though she were preparing not for battle, but for clarity. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Howell's gavel hovered mid-air, the threat of sanctions still echoing, and then came the counterstrike. Crockett's voice was low, deliberate, and sharpened like glass. Judge Howell, you invoke sanctions as though they're your personal weapon, but perhaps you need a reminder. Sanctions exist to protect the integrity of the process, not the ego of the bench. The words landed with surgical precision. No shouting, no theatrics, just truth, articulated with the sting of a scalpel. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters froze mid-pen stroke, some glancing at each other in disbelief. Did she really just say that? Howell blinked, her composure wobbling for the first time. She pressed her lips together, a flash of indignation crossing her face. Congresswoman, she began, but Crockett cut cleanly across her attempt. Respectfully, Judge, I came here today to answer to the people I represent, not to be silenced for your convenience. And if you think your robe gives you the power to mute dissent, then you misunderstand the very Constitution you swore to uphold. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps turned into murmurs. Someone in the gallery let out a stifled, "Wow." The court reporter's fingers clattered faster over the keys, trying to keep pace with history unfolding. Crockett let the moment breathe. She paused, surveying the room, then delivered the line that detonated across Washington. You can sanction me if you wish, but know this, when history looks back, it won't be my name on trial, it will be yours. The chamber erupted not in noise, for people were too stunned to shout, but in the visceral electricity of disbelief. It was as if lightning had struck in slow motion. Even Judge Howell, master of the room for decades, seemed caught off guard. She shifted in her seat, her gavel tapping nervously on the wood, a faint but telling tremor in her hand, and outside those walls, the earthquake began. Phones lifted in the gallery. Tweets exploded onto timelines within seconds. Jasmine Crockett just put Judge Howell in her place. Live. Hashtag Crockett vs. Howell. That wasn't testimony. That was a down. Clips of the moment raced across platforms like wildfire. On Instagram, Reels hit 1 million views before the recess even ended. TikTok edits layered her words over thunderclaps. Captions flashing in bold, "It will be yours." Hashtags vaulted into trending territory. Hashtag mic drop. Hashtag Jasmine Crockett. Hashtag courtroom earthquake. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Howell's unraveling was no longer subtle. Her glare was sharper now, but beneath it was the unmistakable flicker of doubt. Her gavel strikes came faster, not with authority, but with the desperation of someone trying to wrestle back control slipping through her fingers. "Order, order," she barked, but the command rang hollow. The room didn't fear her anymore, it was captivated by the Congresswoman who had just shattered the invisible wall of judicial intimidation. Crockett, by contrast, was a study in calm. She didn't smirk, she didn't gloat. She simply sat, unflinching, her expression steady and resolute. Her demeanor said everything. This isn't personal. This is principle. The juxtaposition was cinematic. One woman cloaked in a robe, her authority rattling like glass about to crack. The other, a lone figure at the table, calm as steel, commanding the moment without raising her voice, beat by beat. The visuals unfolded like a screenplay. Pause. Crockett's words hanging in the air. Statement of precision strike. Ego versus Constitution. Reaction shots. Gasps, stares, trembling gavel, flashing phones. Aftershock hashtags erupting. Clips going viral in real time. It wasn't just a response, it was a courtroom earthquake. Outside, CABLE news producers scrambled to cut into live coverage. Anchor desks lit up with breaking banners. Congresswoman Crockett defies judge in explosive showdown. Commentators leaned in, voices tinged with awe. "I've covered this court for 20 years, one said, and I've never seen anything like that. In Washington bars and living rooms, people replayed the clip, shaking their heads in disbelief. Ordinary viewers weren't parsing legal nuances. They were feeling the raw pulse of someone refusing to bow. Crockett's.com defiance resonated like a chord struck deep. Meanwhile, Judge Howell's every attempt to claw back authority only deepened the contrast. Her voice, once the immovable center of the room, now quivered at the edges. Her gavel no longer commanded silence. It underscored her slipping grasp. And though she sat higher on the bench, it was clear to all who now stood taller. By the time Howell called for a recess, the damage was irreparable. She rose quickly, robe swirling, exiting without her usual regal composure. The optics were unmistakable, the judge retreating, the Congresswoman remaining. Crockett leaned back in her chair, not triumphant in appearance, but steady, almost serene. To her, this wasn't victory for its own sake, it was survival of principle. She had shown that authority could be challenged, that intimidation could be met with clarity. When the gavel struck for recess, the tremors did not stop. They only spread. Within minutes, Washington was buzzing. Commentators who normally cloaked their analysis in layers of neutrality couldn't hide their astonishment. On CNN, a legal analyst shook his head slowly, replaying Crockett's line on loop. "It won't be my name on trial. It will be yours." He called it the most devastating counterpunch I've ever seen delivered inside a federal courtroom. On Fox, anchors who were no allies of Crockett found themselves acknowledging the gravity of what had just unfolded. One pundit muttered, "Look, I don't agree with her politics, but that took guts." Judge Howell lost control of the room, plain and simple. Legal scholars rushed into the fray, weighing in on op-eds and live blogs. Was Crockett skating dangerously close to contempt? Perhaps, but one Yale professor put it bluntly. Sometimes, contempt for overreach is exactly what history demands. We've mythologized moments like this before. Barbara Jordan, Thurgood Marshall, when someone stood in a courtroom and refused to be cowed. But while experts parsed precedent, the public had already crowned its victor. On social media, Crockett's words detonated like fireworks. The clip of her saying, "It will be yours," was spliced into every imaginable context. Memes spread in minutes. Howell photoshopped as a crumbling marble statue, Crockett depicted as holding the hammer instead of the judge. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Crockett unshaken, #courtroom earthquake, #not on trial. Even unexpected corners joined in. Athletes, musicians, comedians, figures with no stake in legal jousting, reposted the clip. One NBA star captioned it, "This is bigger than hoops. This is what standing tall looks like." The groundswell wasn't just digital applause. It felt like national validation. In Crockett, millions saw not a politician, but a proxy. Someone who walked into an arena stacked against her and refused to flinch. She became, in real time, the voice of resistance, not with slogans, but with clarity sharpened against authority itself. Contrast sharpened the framing. Judge Howell, long a fixture of establishment power, was suddenly cast as the embodiment of a brittle elite, cloaked in robes but stripped of reverence. Crockett, by contrast, radiated grassroots dignity. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a stand-in for everyone who had ever been told to sit down, to pipe down, to submit, and the ripple effect reached further than her own base. Even her political rivals, grudging though they were, could not entirely ignore the spectacle. A centrist senator tweeted, carefully hedging, "While I may not share Representative Crockett's style, I respect her courage in speaking truth to power." Another House member, usually her foil in debate, admitted on a podcast, "I didn't expect her to handle Howell like that, but she did." That was the quiet power of the moment. Crockett had forced even opponents to acknowledge her steel. The imagery of Howell's trembling gavel versus Crockett's unflinching calm was too stark to ignore. By evening, the ripple had swollen into a wave. Cable news ran endless replays. TikTok teens mashed her speech into beats. Hashtags refused to die down. And on the ground, in cafes and classrooms, people quoted her line with reverence. "It won't be my name on trial. It will be yours." It wasn't just applause, it was reclamation. Crockett had reframed the confrontation from a one-off skirmish into something larger, a question of who truly stands on trial when power tries to silence dissent, and as one commentator summed it up late that night, the verdict was already in. Judge Howell came to sanction Jasmine Crockett. Instead, Crockett sanctioned her, and the country saw it live. But this was no finale. If anything, the spark had just been struck. Because Crockett didn't just win applause, she reframed the entire fight. When the echoes of that courtroom clash finally settled, something larger had taken root. What Jasmine Crockett did was not simply a tactical win against a frustrated judge. It was something far greater, a living reminder that when authority hardens into arrogance, truth itself becomes resistance. That the lesson was clear. Authority, even dressed in robes and wielding gavels, is not sacred when it turns from fairness to intimidation. And courage, even when voiced by one woman against the weight of the system, can expose the hollowness of that intimidation in an instant. This wasn't about Jasmine Crockett versus Judge Beryl Howell. It was never only about that. It was about us, about the American people, watching and weighing what it means to stand unshaken in the face of power. Crockett's defiance became symbolic of every person who has felt silenced in a meeting, pushed aside in a boardroom, dismissed in a courtroom, or told they weren't fit to speak. In that sense, she wasn't speaking for herself. She was speaking for millions. Tar move transformed a courtroom scuffle into a moral reckoning. It told us that dignity will always outweigh arrogance. That clarity, when spoken without apology, can outshine even the loudest threats. And that no amount of procedural hammering can crush the simple power of standing tall. Look closer. and you'll see why the moment resonated so deeply. Because every time truth collides with authority, the instinct of fear whispers, "Stay quiet, don't risk it." But Crockett showed that silence isn't safety, it's surrender. And surrender is what keeps the powerful comfortable. Her refusal to bow, even for a second, rewrote that script. She modeled that courage is not loudness, but steadiness. Not defiance for its own sake, but the insistence that truth will not be bent to fit power's demands, and so the moral endures. When authority is abused, truth must answer. When intimidation rises, resistance is not rebellion, it is dignity. That is why this night, this moment, became larger than the courtroom. Because long after the legal details fade, long after transcripts are filed away, people will remember the image, a judge pressing down, and a congresswoman refusing to bend. One symbolizing brittle hierarchy, the other, unshaken truth. It was the triumph of clarity over coercion, of principle over posturing, of courage over fear, and that is why it struck such a chord. We are a nation built on the idea that power must answer to the people, not the other way around. Crockett's words weren't only hers, they were the echo of every fight in our history where dignity stood taller than intimidation. And that's why this night will be remembered long after the gavel's echo faded. And so we return to the title of this story. Judge Beryl Howell attempts to sanction Jasmine Crockett. Her next move leaves courtroom stunned. Because that is exactly what happened. What began as a show of force by a judge known for her iron grip became the moment of her own undoing. What was meant to silence a voice only amplified it. Instead of stamping out Jasmine Crockett's fire, Judge Howell poured gasoline on it, and the flames lit up the entire nation. Crockett's move was not just a response, it was a recalibration of power. In one breath, she exposed the cracks and arrogance, and in the next, she carved her name into the record of resistance. That's why people will remember this night. Not for the sanction that almost was, but for the courage that could not be contained. And now, it's your turn. If this story shook you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you believe in dignity, standing tall against arrogance, subscribe so you don't miss the stories that matter. And most of all, join the conversation below. Because democracy doesn't thrive on silence, it thrives on voices like yours. This wasn't just Crockett's victory, it was a reminder for all of us. When power tries to intimidate, truth can still speak louder. And when truth is spoken with courage, it echoes far beyond four walls. Because at the end of the day, dignity deserves the last word.